Hi, my name is Jim Piekarski, and I am a retired psychotherapist, and I also teach at our local Buddhist center, Blue Lotus Buddhist Meditation Center here in Venice, Florida, where I live. Um, Today, I want to talk about an important topic. This topic is intimately involved with most people suffering. So the more people understand about this topic, the more helpful it can be to them. I think it's kind of something that should be taught to everyone. Um, So it's one way to kind of break down suffering and help people understand the suffering in their lives. So what we're going to really do is we're going to talk about we're either reacting to something that's real and that causes pain, or we're reacting to something that's just going on in our heads, like some story that's going on in our heads. So real things are like getting older, getting ill, facing death, um, loss. We all lose people, and we have to deal with the grief. So real acceptance. Real acceptance is how we deal with these things. We have to accept them. When we don't accept them, typically what happens is that we are absorbed in some story in our head instead. Um, I shouldn't have this illness. This shouldn't be happening to me. Why me? All these um, things that create emotional reactions in us. These emotional reactions are not happy reactions. They're sad or angry or whatever. So all real events in our lives need to be dealt with by meeting them with acceptance. It seems like that through hardship, one of the things we learn is to be really able to accept things. And so life teaches us this lesson. Once we accept what is happening, we come to peace. Um, Acceptance means emotional and psychological acceptance. Not It doesn't mean giving up. We still get medical treatment, or we still take care of whatever we need to take care of. Um, but besides what's actually happening, uh, we also have stories in our head, and these stories in our head we react to emotionally also. So, for instance, um, it's really important that we be able to tell the difference between the pain we are going through due to real events and that caused by our distorted thinking. Um, this can be very challenging because we can experience them right around the same time. I had a friend who was going through the grief of a breakup, and he was talking to me about it. And besides the challenge of accepting the grief, because he really had to accept that this girl was gone, um, he also had these delusions going. These delusions going is like, I'll never be happy without her. Well, if I just call her one more time, I can get her to come back. All kinds of delusions that stopped him basically from accepting what was happening, um, and added to his frustration and his sadness. So this can be very confusing because on one level he knew that the grief was real, and on another level he was adding all kinds of unreal stuff to it, and he could, you know, kind of imagine that all this other stuff was real too because the grief was real. Um, so our reactions to the stories that go through our head can be as strong as the reactions to life. Certainly, if somebody dies, we respond very, very strongly to that, and we feel grief. However, we can also respond very strongly to the stories in our heads. We are attracted to fiction. So we go to movies, we watch TV, we read novels, and we can become very emotional in response to these things. Interestingly, we know these things are fiction, and yet we get involved with them and we still respond very emotionally. Um, one of the problems is that the stories in our head are fiction also. And they're fiction, but the thing is, we don't know they're fiction. We actually believe it. And because we believe it, what happens is that they're even more powerful in terms of generating emotion in us, negative emotions. So when we're going through a difficult patch, it's extremely important to know what's real and what is just a story. So this particular discrimination is essential. You have to ask yourself, is this something I'm responding to that's real, like an actual loss, or is this a story? I'll never have anybody else. Oh, this is going to be horrible. I might as well end my life right now, etc., etc., etc. So this skill to be able to discriminate between what is a story and what is, you know, actual is extremely important. Meditation can be very helpful in this because when we meditate, what happens is we're developing the skill to be able to stand back from our thinking. And when we stand back from our thinking, we can see what we're thinking rather than just be lost in it. And by seeing what we're thinking, we can evaluate it. We can actually say, is this really true what I'm thinking or is it not? So, so the thing is, a real situation demands acceptance. These stories in our head demand something totally different. They demand inquiry and questioning. We need to see if they're false because typically they are false and they're just creating negative emotions for us. So if we can see the truth and see that they're false and they're just stories in our head and they don't have any real validity, what happens is we can let them go. But you just can't force yourself to let them go. You have to see through it. Because once you see the truth, you just see the truth. And it's like, you just realize, oh, that's a lie. I'm not going to believe it anymore. So you can also have thoughts in your head that block acceptance. So for instance, you can, like my friend, he can say, oh, if I just call her one more time, maybe she'll come back to me. If I just go visit her, I can convince her to come back to me. So these are all stories that he's telling himself that really make it almost impossible for him to accept the grief because he's not letting go. And even if he does accept the grief, he can create other stories like, my life is over, what's the point, all these things. Um, so, so there are many thoughts that people can go through during loss that create suffering. You probably have done some yourself because we all do this. We all have real situations that we need to accept, and we all have this thoughts going through our head that create all kinds of stories about things. So let's look at some of these stories. So what are some of the challenges you experienced where you created a negative story about it that increased your suffering? Just think about that for a moment because we all have done it. So it's just a matter of thinking about what that is. So, and certain types of stories can create different kinds of emotions. So certain stories can create anger, and, somebody hits us and that's a real anger. But we can also have anger based upon our stories. I can't believe that person did that to me. They dissed me. They did this. They did that. Da 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 da. And we run these things over in our mind. And as we run these things over in our minds, what happens is we respond to them emotionally. And what happens is we feed our emotion by keeping responding to these different stories that produce anger. There's also stories that increase sadness. So increased sadness is like, oh, my life is over. I can't go on without this. I'll never find anybody else. I'm a loser. Sometimes that can create sadness or depression. So there's stories that are associated with depression, and a lot of times depression and sadness are very similar. So stories associated with depression are things like, I'm no good, life is horrible, what's the point, I'll never get anywhere. These are stories of, kind of like there's no point, there's no use of going on. So a lot of times depression can trigger suicidality, because the story doesn't have a happy ending in our minds. It only has a negative ending. So what's the point if it's just going to be a negative ending? So then we start thinking of suicide. So these suicidal thoughts come from reacting to these stories that go through our mind over time. There are stories that create anxiety. Now, typically what happens is that the stories about anxiety are stories about the future. Oh, it's not going to work out. If I get up in front of everybody, I'm going to stutter and people will laugh at me. If you had to get up in front of people and talk, because a lot of people are afraid of that. So we project into the future and we see a negative thing happening in the future. And when we see a negative thing happening in the future, what happens is it creates anxiety in us. And so it makes it very difficult for us to face certain situations. Um, so think about this yourself, because it's like there's two things within this that are incredibly important. One is to tell the difference between something that's real and something that's just based on a story in your mind. We respond emotionally to both. We respond emotionally to situations in our lives, and we respond to the fictions in our mind, just like we respond to the fictions in a novel or a movie. Um, so that's the first skill you have to have. Another skill that has to be developed is that you have to become very vigilant about your own emotions. So as soon as you start feeling negative in any way, you have to ask yourself, am I responding to something real, or am I responding to a story in my mind? So being attentive to these changes in emotion, particularly when your emotions start going south and getting bad in some way. So, to actually stop and say, what am I thinking right now? What am I thinking right now that is creating this negative belief? That is not creating, that is a belief that's creating a negative feeling. One person I just ran into was going through openness to spirituality. And when they opened to spirituality, they found out that a lot of their individual or personality stuff was not that important to them anymore. But they found that the peace was boring. And so they created a story of boredom. And when they created a story of boredom, they couldn't enjoy the peace. They couldn't just, peace has a certain joy to it. And so they couldn't experience this because they created a story of boredom or pointlessness. So, two skills. One is to discriminate between, are we reacting to something that's real, or reacting to a story? The second skill is, every time I'm feeling bad, I need to be alert and ask myself, what story am I creating? Am I just creating this emotion on my own? Because if I just keep thinking that way, I can create negative feelings for a long time. I remember when I was younger and I didn't really understand this stuff very much, I'd go for weeks, and then all of a sudden I would come to this after 2 or 3 weeks. I go, I got to stop thinking this way. And then all of a sudden I would get out of some mood that I'd been in for weeks. And I couldn't get out of that mood until I realized really clearly that the mood was due to my thinking. And it wasn't something that was just happening. It was something I was creating. And so being able to, be very attentive to the changes in emotion. And as soon as they get negative, to ask ourselves, what am I thinking right now? And once we understand that we're reacting to our thoughts, we have to ask ourselves, are these thoughts actually true? Is it true I'll never find anybody else? Is it true that I can never be happy? Is it true that life is pointless? These are just interpretations. They're just interpretations thrown on things. And these interpretations are very negative, and they create negative emotions. So the Buddha said that one of the things that creates suffering is delusion. And so these are delusions. They're wrong thinking. They're thinking that's not true. And so he was correct, because if we find out that we're deluded about something, we can decrease our suffering. The other thing about this is that modern psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, they really understand that a lot of our emotions come to reactions to our thoughts. So if our thoughts are really negative, what happens is we're going to respond emotionally to them. And this really kind of goes right along with what the Buddha said. So if we really want to be happy, we really have to develop these two skills. Again, I'll reiterate the skills. One is to discriminate between, am I reacting to a real event, or am I reacting to a story in my mind? And the other skill is that as soon as I feel bad, I need to ask myself, how am I talking to myself right now? What is the story that's going through my mind? And is this story negative? And am I responding negatively to it? Because otherwise, you can continue that story for a long time. And if you don't look at it, what happens is you just keep creating negative feelings for yourself. Like I did when I was younger. I would create negative feeling for 2 or 3 weeks before I'd wake up. Luckily I woke up, and was able to stop it. But now, what I really try to do, as soon as I'm feeling bad about something, to really ask myself, how am I interpreting this event, and how am I talking to myself about it? Is it something real? So yeah, okay. One thing is I have a tremor in my right hand. Okay, that's something real. I need to accept it. Okay, I don't want it, but also, it's enough challenge. I don't need to make up negative stories about it. I don't need to tell myself how bad it is and how bad it's going to be, and maybe it's going to turn into Parkinson's disease and all this other stuff that I can run through my mind that does me no good at all, because I can't predict the future and I can't deal with anything that's in the future. I can only deal with what's happening right now. And because this tremor is real, I can accept it. And by accepting it, what happens is that it's like accepting the fact you can't fly. It's just a limitation that I have. It's a little hard to write and type and do some other things like that. So again, 2 skills. Is it a story or is it a real event? The other skill is, am I feeling bad? What am I saying to myself right now? How am I interpreting my life right now? Am I interpreting it in a negative way? If you can develop these skills, what will happen is you can reduce the amount of suffering in your life probably 80-90%. It's amazing how these little things are so powerful. And the important thing is to kind of really specify it and understand it. A lot of people just do this intuitively. They just learn through life to do this, and they never really spell it out for themselves. Now, what I wanted to do was really spell it out so that people who didn't get it intuitively could look at it and really come to an understanding so that they could be happy also. So good luck with this. And if you ever in Venice, Florida, come to Blue Lotus Buddhist Meditation Center. We have great meditations and teachings. And also I'm usually on Zoom on Sundays at 4 o'clock. If you ever want to tune into that, you can go to blbmc.org and find the links to all these things. We have also meditations online also. So thank you for your attention and good luck to you. Hopefully this will benefit you in some way. That's the purpose of me putting this on YouTube. And thank you.